2nd. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club. This is Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, July 11th. Great to see you all tonight, or I should say, admit you all to the room. We got some recent Zoom bombers, so we're starting off the program with everybody's video off and everybody muted. Joining me tonight is Henry Shepke, our VBC intern, and you will notice that Glenn is not here as at this point, but and Todd as well. It's because we also have a board meeting going on at the same time, but we wanted to provide a program for tonight because we've been off for a couple weeks. So tonight, things are going to go a little bit differently tonight than we're used to. Glenn, along with Greg Yost and Colin Heaton and Ken Kazak, all recorded a conversation about the Battle of Britain. They did this a couple days ago. I took that, I edited it, and ran it through on QuickTime. So we're going to play that tonight, and it's a really fascinating discussion. So I hope that you, if anything, you can sit back, turn up your volume, maybe take care of something else while you're listening in. But also, we have the chat open. So if any questions come in, and I believe Greg Yost is here with us, if any chat comes in, questions during the program, Greg will be in the chat answering any of the questions that you may have. It runs about an hour, 5 minutes, like our normal conversations. After that, we'll do our station break. And then I know that Glenn's going to take a break from the board meeting, pop over to us, and we're going to be able to ask him questions about the conversation about the Battle of Britain. And Ken Kazak will also be, he's joining the room as well. For those of you who may be new to us, we are the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing it since 2008. And we've been online for probably about the last 4 years. And we're online every Monday night at 7 and every Thursday night at 7. Thursday nights are more focused singularly on the Greatest Generation Live, or Greatest Generation, I'm sorry. And that'll be tonight's program. So if you are interested in more about the VBC, please visit our website, because these programs are only made possible by your generous support. And you can donate to the VBC by going to www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. On there, you can also check out our blog, check out all of our past events. You can even sign up for our free quarterly magazine, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Without further ado, I'm going to dive right into our recording, and I'll be letting people into the room as we go along here. And like I said, if any questions pop in your head during this presentation, please just put them into the chat, and we're going to have Glenn with us later on in the program. So let me go ahead and hit the share button, and we are going to share sound, optimize for video, bring this up. Here we are. Thank you for your patience, everybody. There we are. And if anybody has anything in the chat, if you're not seeing this video, please let me know. I'm going to bring my screen over. Here we are, and we'll get going. All right. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy.
Welcome to our Thursday night Greatest Generation Live audience. Always good to have everybody here. Tonight, we're going to focus on the Battle of Britain. I think you see already, I have the title page up here on the computer. I set up a PowerPoint to walk us through the Battle of Britain. I should have had, at one point I did have, Battle of Britain subtitled and its impact on the U.S. election and the war, which I've always thought is a fascinating part of the story. And I'm going to touch on that some. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I'm going to touch on that as we go through this. So we're recording this a few days before the actual broadcast on Thursday, due to a conflict that I have with a Veterans Breakfast Club board meeting, also scheduled for Thursday night. So it's a little different than we've done before, but we're going to give it a shot. I'm really, really fortunate to have an expert panel with me today. They volunteered to participate in this and help me out with this. One is Colin Heaton. Colin, say hello, please.
Hello, everyone.
And I think everybody knows Colin from the many, many contributions he's made over the past 7 or 8 months towards our air war over Europe discussions. Next, we have Ken Kasich. Ken, say hello, please.
Hey, good evening, everybody.
Ken's another VBC member and been on many of our programs and always asks excellent questions. And I think when you saw we were doing something on the Battle of Britain, Ken, you sent me some information and read through that. And then finally, we have Greg Yost, who you're not going to be able to see, but I'm hoping you can hear. Greg, can you say hello?
Yes, it's great to be on the program. Thanks for asking me. I want to mention to everyone, I did not personally participate in the Battle of Britain, but I've studied it extensively, as the rest of us have, and might have something to contribute. Thanks for asking.
At least not in this life, Greg, maybe in another life. You do look a lot like Lord Beaverbrook, so maybe that was you back then. Okay, so let's get started on this really fascinating and obviously very key battle at the beginning of World War II. So in order to understand the Battle of Britain, you have to understand the Battle of France, which took place just a few weeks, 6 weeks before it, right? And this is the classic map of the Battle of France in May 1940. The Germans had already taken the Scandinavian countries a month or so before, and everybody was waiting for the Germans to attack. The question always was, as in the two previous attacks in the two previous generations, is which way they're going to come from, right? The French had built the Maginot Line, right? Down here, you can see it where my pointer is, as a way to try to protect themselves from an attack right across the frontier from Germany. In World War I, they had come through Belgium, and the thought was they would do the same thing again. What the Germans did in a brilliant tactical move, strategic tactical move, was they did attack through Germany. I'm sorry, through Brussels. And you see these lines up in the north. The French and the British Expeditionary Force, which had been waiting for months on the Belgium-French frontier, moved up to counter that attack. And they found themselves trapped because the Germans were able to fight their way through, fight mostly for the first few days, the mountains and the rugged terrain, fight their way through the Ardennes forest, which most people thought was impassable by tanks. But they did it. And they got to Sedan, where there's an important battle. They break through at Sedan, Rommel leading the way along with von Manstein and others. And they cut off the French and British Expeditionary Force. That led, that was on May 9th. On May 10th, Churchill becomes prime minister. Now, he doesn't become prime minister because of the the German invasion of France. It actually had a lot more to do with what had happened in Norway, and it just almost sort of coincided with these two, with the invasion. But Churchill becomes prime minister on May 10th, 1940, and I've got quite a bit about Churchill in here because I like Churchill. So I make these things up, so I get to put in what I like. And here's his first of several famous speeches he makes at Parliament. The blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech on May 13th. I'll let you read it, but he talks about what is their war aim. It's victory, victory at any cost, victory in spite of all terror, however long and hard the road may be. I really believe that Churchill, this was his moment in history in the next few weeks where he saves the Western world from the onslaught of the Germans. One of the key developments early on in the Battle of Britain is that Lord Beaverbrook Winston Churchill appoints this man, Lord Beaverbrook, who was a publishing magnate. I don't remember the names of the newspapers, but one of the biggest publishers in the country, a great friend of Churchill's. He appoints him Minister of Airplane Production. Do I have that right, experts? Airplane production, right? And you wouldn't think it because nobody thought he was a particularly smart or well-known industrialist, but he was an extremely hard-driven man, and he plays a key role in the next few weeks, the next couple of months, in driving the production of British fighter planes, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, and taking wrecked fighter planes and reworking them so they could fly again. And arguably is one of the best appointments Winston Churchill made during the war, during these early days. Of course, as we all know, I'll go through this real quick. The Germans had broken through. The British and the French retreat, and finally they are surrounded at Dunkirk. This is another key moment in the war. This is in May, I think May 21, May 22, if I have those dates right, about that time, when it looked like the British army is going to be destroyed on the beaches of Dunkirk. And instead, the Germans hesitate. They stop advancing for 3 days or so. And there's many, many stories about this as to why they stopped. One is that Göring said, don't bother with attacking any further. I'll take care of them from the air. Another is that Hitler wanted to pause. He wanted to let the British survive because he thought he could reach an agreement with the British to end the war in the West. I don't know, any of our panel, any of you have a comment on this? Because this is such a key part of the story. Colin?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were two reasons. First of all, the German army was so burned out being high on methamphetamine that they needed a break. And Goering had told Hitler, according to the officers I interviewed, that he felt that he could go ahead and reduce their numbers by air power, which proved not to be the case. The Royal Air Force really did rise to the occasion and support the Dunkirk beaches. But another problem was the Germans ran out of fuel. They had to wait for their fuel supplies to catch up to the tanks and the other vehicles. They ran out of gas, which most people don't realize. And the fighter units were the same way. They had to get their fuel resupply brought up, and they had to get that fuel from Romania. So I mean, they were kind of like they shot their bolt fast and hard, but then they just petered out.
There's a great book by a German historian that's been translated in English. It's just called Blitzkrieg. I think his last name is Fritz, if I'm not mistaken. Should have looked it up, but he makes many of those same points, Colin. And he said it was von Rundstedt who insisted on the stopping, that von Rundstedt and Manstein were at loggerheads with each other continuously for the previous few weeks. And had it been left up to von Manstein, he would have, taken Dunkirk quickly rather than pausing.
Yeah, Rundstedt knew that if the army had continued on being undersupplied, that they ran the risk of being destroyed in place by any residual British or French components. Manstein was more aggressive. He wanted to keep pushing. Rundstedt was more of the cautious type. He wanted to wait till he could rebuild the resources that they had used and then push. But then Hitler gave it an order that no one was to make a decision until he gave the word. And that was, well, three of the generals I interviewed who survived the war that were old men said the same thing. They said that Hitler gave the order. He took Rundstedt's advice and said, okay, we'll get you resupplied. And there's no way they're going to get out of Dunkirk. We've got the time. There's no rush. And then Goering said, well, if you're going to do that, I'll just deal with them from the air until the ground forces catch up, but I should be able to take care of the problem.
Yeah, the other element this man makes in his book is, any military is always conscious of the war they fought before. And the war they fought before was World War I. And what happened wrong for the Germans in World War I? They were not able to take Paris. Right? They weren't able to outflank Paris and come in from behind. And he makes the argument that in addition to all those things you've stated, Colin, that in Hitler's mind, I mean, at this point, they've not taken Paris. Paris comes 2-3 weeks later. And in Hitler's mind, with von Rundstedt reinforcing it because of the wear and tear on the German army, he needed to pause so that the army could rest and repair itself in order to be able to turn around and take Paris. So, but it is absolutely a key point. Eventually the British do evacuate, as we all know, 300 or so thousand troops, lose all their equipment. They also evacuate tens of thousands of French troops. and the British Army lives to fight another day.
Glenn, I will add something here in terms of fighting that last war. If you go back to your last slide there, that sort of gets you up to Dunkirk, where yes, okay. You will notice that the Germans sort of make a left hook towards the coast when they get into Belgium. And the French and the British assumed that the Germans were going to do what they tried to do in World War I, just come straight down into Paris. So you look at all the French forces, very few French are up there at Dunkirk. Most of the French are sort of defending Paris against the non-attack, at least at this point. And so it was sort of a fake out. The Allies got faked out and the British really got caught on the coast there. Everyone just assumed the Germans were going to make a right hook towards Paris, and they made the left hook towards the sea, which really captured the British at Dunkirk. So that was both the Allies were really faked out on that one because they were fighting the last war, and to a certain extent the Germans weren't. I won't steal your thunder here on the Dunkirk thing, but obviously I think if the British had those 300 or 400,000 troops captured there as POWs, there is no way that Churchill would have been able to mobilize the people. All those POWs would have created such a. I might be stealing your thunder there, so I'll let you go on there. But clearly, the evacuation of Dunkirk allowed the British to continue in a way. If those had been POWs, it just wouldn't have happened.
Well, and there's another political element to this that it doesn't get played up a lot, but it is there. And that's that the battle of the rescue of the British Army Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk allows, I think, Winston Churchill to hold off those in the British cabinet who wanted to, enter into negotiations with Hitler. Mm-hmm. And he wins that. We're not going to get into that. We just don't have the time. That's a whole nother story and a fascinating one on which there's many books. But he wins that argument partly because he still has some troops to fight with. Colin?
Well, there was also one more thing, too. The successful evacuation of Dunkirk solidified Churchill's wartime position, meaning that he could convince Roosevelt in the U.S. to support him with Lend-Lease.
Yeah, well, that's coming up here in this story, right? Another great speech by Churchill just after the miracle at Dunkirk. And that's the "We shall fight on the beaches" speech. We shall fight on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. And some people forget that even though Dunkirk was successfully evacuated, there was still a battle going on in France. Paris had not been taken. In fact, some British troops that came back, some British commanders, I should say, that came back, being Alan Brooke, was sent back to France through Brittany. And there were 2 or 3 divisions of British troops that he commanded, which, he was not happy with. And eventually they were able to be evacuated as well as the French overran France. So the next part of this story, which I've always found fascinating, is here we are, FDR, you just mentioned him, President of the United States, and here it is, only a few months before the 1940 presidential election, and he's thinking third term, right? Considering it anyway. Would there be a third term? Would the voters allow a third term? There was nothing at that time in the Constitution that prevented a third term. It was strictly a tradition, all right? And the Battle of Britain and the Battle of France and then Britain played an important role, right? It was almost at exactly the same time that the first America First was created. And Charles Lindbergh became the celebrity spokesman. This is part of what became known as the Great Debate in the United States. And what Roosevelt and the Democrats and what were called the Internationalists at that time, what they were fighting was the Neutrality Act that had been passed in the 1930s and amended several times in the late 30s that made it very difficult for Roosevelt to support the British. But then you see how he gets around it. I've always loved this series of cartoons. I actually have about a dozen of them. If you look real close in the lower left corner, this cartoon is by Dr. Seuss, who was an editorial cartoonist. before he became famous after the war, and in the 50s became the famous Dr. Seuss. There's a whole series of them, all of them so very well done, and all of them sort of a harbinger of what he becomes with these characters that he shows. Okay, anybody else want to comment on this so far?
Maybe a little deeper history, going back to the Neutrality Act. Certainly with the Great Depression, there was a lot of belief that the US had gotten conned into World War I, that it was arms manufacturers and bankers who got the US into this war that really made no difference and just cost 100,000 US lives. So during the Depression, there was the fear of not getting involved in the passage of the Neutrality Act. I think that what we just talked about here, the 6-week conquest of France, really woke the United States up. They were not fighting the First World War. It wasn't 4 years of trench warfare where 10,000 lives get fought over half a mile. Things really changed in the US when they saw what had happened in 6 weeks there. So.
Well, and you'll see my point as I go through some of this is that it changes the presidential election dramatically, which I'll talk about in a minute. The Germans do turn around, and they do pretty quickly take Paris. There's a famous picture of Hitler with a couple of his henchmen standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. The French retreat. Marshal Pétain becomes the head of the French government, and Vichy France is then created. And the French control all, most of continental Europe, and Britain stands alone. So, Colin, I was reading about this, and I watched that TV program, that documentary I mentioned to you, Wolfgang Martini, which I found to be a fascinating name for a German. Tell us about him. What was he in charge of?
Wolfgang Martini was in charge of technology and communications for the Luftwaffe. He had been appointed by Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who was second to Goering in command of the Luftwaffe. And Milch, by the way, was a Jew. So Martini was the grandson of an Italian immigrant, I believe. Some of the officers I interviewed knew him personally, and they liked him. They said that he was great, but he and Goering got along like fire and water, much like some of the UK officers. But Martini was the guy who began working with Joseph Kammhuber on developing German radar because they wanted to have the technology, especially after the British began bombing at night. They really wanted to enhance their radar. But Martini was really big into encrypted communications. And he thought that he could decode these strange signals coming out of Britain from these towers. And he's the one who figured out it was radar, but they couldn't quite figure out how to decipher it and how to deal with it. But it was Martini who first realized that the Enigma coding machines had been compromised, and he proved it to Goering. And Goering said, we'll change the Luftwaffe codes, add another rotor. The Navy was a little behind that with Admiral Dönitz, and it cost the U-boat force. But Martini was a very intelligent guy. I think he had a degree in mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or something like that.
Yeah, and he's the man. I got this photo of the Graf Zeppelin up. He's the man that directs the Graf Zeppelin to make a journey just before the start of the just in early May, I think, or maybe it was the spring of 1940, to investigate the British radar system.
Yeah, he sent the Zeppelins on these surveillance reconnaissance missions, basically with a lot of electronic detection gear to pick up signals, radio signals, anything they could pick up, because they knew that eventually, at the end of the day, later on down the road, they would have to have a database of information from which they could decipher and decode enemy transmissions. So his job was to collect as much electronic material as he could so that the guys in Berlin could sit there and figure out how to decode and decrypt all this stuff.
But as I understand it, right, they make, I think it's 2 trips the Graf Zeppelin makes, and it sees all this, and it hears all of this radio activity, all of this chatter, right? But they misunderstand what it is. They don't understand that it's actually this radar system that the Brits have put in place.
Yeah, Martini thought it was a special shortwave radio transmission beacon. He thought it might have been something along the lines of a homing device to guide aircraft back to base or something like that, which is a very, very plausible explanation given the fact the Germans had just developed a similar thing with their technology. So that's what he was thinking it was. He wasn't really reading it as radar at that time.
Yeah. The other way I understood it is they put what they called the chain home early warning system in place, and they have these series of radar towers up and down the coast, right? But as a source of power, and I'm not sure about the exact science behind this, if I can explain it, as a source of power, they depended on the British electrical grid. And
Yeah.
somehow that confused Martini when he heard those signals coming out of the British electrical grid. And he made that mistake of, because the Germans were also pretty far advanced in developing radar, but from a whole different technical point of view.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the British were using a direct current application and the Germans were using the alternating current application. So that would explain the difference in the signatures he was receiving, which is probably why he didn't understand what it was.
Yeah. So obviously the radar plays a huge role in the upcoming Battle of Britain, but just fascinating to me that the Germans miss it, even though it was right there, right in front of their face. They're looking at it, and it's the old, I can't see the forest because the trees are all in the way. Just one of those mistakes that, had it not been made, might have changed the outcome of the battle.
Yeah, the Germans were a little late catching on to that, and I give the British a lot of credit because just like there are so many anomalies, just like with the D-Day parachute drops. I mean, because they were scattered all over the place, the Germans thought it was a much larger invasion. Same here. There was so much electronic traffic coming into Wolfgang Martini's people that they were overwhelmed with it. They didn't know what to segregate, separate, analyze. They were totally lost.
So this all occurs just before the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain breaks out. This is May and June of 1944. And then I just jump back to what's going on in the United States. And I think there's two key appointments that Roosevelt makes just before the Republicans gather together in Philadelphia for their nominating convention. And one is Henry Stimson, who becomes Secretary of War, and the other is Franklin Knox, who becomes Secretary of Navy. And these were hardcore Republicans. Knox had run as vice president in 1936. Stimson had been Secretary of War for previous Republican presidents and held many high-level positions. He was, incredibly well known in those circles. But they were very frustrated with the Republican Party because they were both high-level interventionists. And the Republican Party at that time had become very much an isolationist party, all right? And this was just such an adroit move by Roosevelt just a few days before the Republican nominating convention, which takes place in Philadelphia, June 24th to 28th. And out of that convention, much to the surprise of everybody, comes the Republican nominee, Wendell Willkie, who was an interventionist. He was the darkest of dark horses 6 weeks before. Had been a Democrat, a registered Democrat at one time, turns Republican. He's a lawyer, sort of a New York corporate lawyer, as I recall. And the events in Europe, the fall of France, the lingering battle of Britain, which looks like the Germans are just going to run right over Britain as well from our point of view. He beats out, I think it's Robert Taft, Dewey, who eventually in 44 wins, and can't remember, there was another prominent Republican isolationist, Vandenberg, maybe. Anyway, well, he becomes the Republican nominee. I'm sorry, someone else mentioned a name?
It was Vandenberg, yeah, the senator from Michigan, right, yeah. Who later becomes, after the war, well, it's Vandenberg Air Force Base, but getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. And then I'm going to show you here, and a few more slides later, what a huge difference it makes with Roosevelt having Wendell Willkie, another interventionist or internationalist as his opponent, as opposed to if had he run against, say, Robert Taft, who was an isolationist. It would have been a very different presidential race. Roosevelt may still have won, but a couple of key things happened because of that. So now we're in late June 1940, and the Battle of Britain begins. It begins sort of gradually with the Luftwaffe attacking British shipping and British ports, as you see here. And of course, they're gathering their forces. They're moving their air bases up to the French coast so that it's much, much closer to Britain. Hitler is hoping that he can reach some sort of treaty with the British all through June, maybe even into July, and realizes eventually that he cannot reach that goal, that Churchill is going to, obviously oppose him. What I tried to show here, and we're going to see this for those of our travelers that are on listening to this program, this is one of the internal scenes at Oxford, and we're going to the Royal Air Force Museum at Oxford. So, that chain home radar system, in my mind, becomes really the first sophisticated weapons system, if you will, right? There's the radar out there, right? There's coast watchers out there. And then there's all these people in these bunkers. And I think Oxford was the primary one, tracking all these movements of the Luftwaffe as they gather over France and then come towards Germany. And this gives them an incredible capability to marshal the RAF, the fighter forces, against the Luftwaffe forces as they begin to cross over into Germany. So it's a huge advantage that the British have that, Colin, as I recall, as I understand, the Germans really had very little understanding of what they were facing in those lines.
Yeah, I mean, all the German pilots and commanders that fought in the Battle of Britain that I knew and interviewed, when they first started assaulting, their first mission was to escort bombers. The bombers would go and bomb ports, bomb ships. The Stukas would hit ships in the channel or in the ports, and the fighters were just fighter escort. They weren't to engage or go chasing enemy fighters. Their job was to protect the bombers. Well, that changed because Hugh Dowding, who at that time was chief of fighter command, had started utilizing the chain home method to vector his fighters to encounter the Germans when he could. And that changed the dynamic when Gallen had a meeting with Goering and some of the others like Joachim Munchberg. They all sat with Goering and said, look, we can't be stuck with these bombers. We're getting carved up here because we have to be free to go attack these fighters. And Goering said, okay, then we'll bomb their airfields and take them out that way. But that shifted when Lee Mallory began trying to implement his big wing theory, which turned out to be a pretty drastic maneuver that didn't serve the RAF well at all. And very few of the squadron leaders were on board with it, which meant that he would just throw everything he had from all the airfields into the air to wait for the Germans to come across because they knew they were going to be there. And that was just a big waste of time and a waste of fuel and a waste of pilots and aircraft in many cases. So Dowding's argument was stick to using the chain home method, stick to using the plot board, stick to using vectoring by radio, and scramble only those units who are in direct line of contact with the incoming German force. And that economized the RAF and allowed them to succeed while outnumbered 4 and 5 to 1 on the average day.
Let's just talk about the airplanes that were in the air for both sides. This is the British fighter, the Hurricane, right, which began production in the late 30s. Could not match the Messerschmitt 109, but it was better than anything the British had before that, right?
Well, the Hurricane was very good at what it was sent to do. The Hurricanes were sent to attack the bombers for two reasons. One, they had heavier armaments than the Spitfires. They were 50% fabric coverage, so even if they took defensive fire, nothing vital was going to get hit unless the engine of the pilot was hit. But another thing about the Hurricane was if they did engage the 109s, the Hurricane could on most occasions with a good pilot always turn inside a 109. The turning dogfight always went to the Hurricane. The 109 couldn't turn inside the Hurricane in most occasions. The Spitfire was equal in the turning radius to the Messerschmitt. It also had slightly better range, but not much, but it didn't matter. It was fighting defensively anyway. And the early Spitfire Mark 1s had 303 caliber machine guns. Later versions had cannons like the Hurricane, of course, the Hurricane 2 with 20 millimeter cannons. But the Spitfires were far lower in numbers of availability than Hurricanes. But as you know, they got all the glory from the Battle of Britain because they tangled with the fighters.
Right. I was always surprised at that there were actually, many more Hurricanes than there were Spitfires. But luckily the Spitfire production problems got ironed out just in time to become at least a factor in the battle.
Well, you could build 3 Hurricanes for the price of 1 Spitfire, and you could build a Hurricane twice as fast as you could a Spitfire. And one of the reasons why so many German pilots gained so many victories against them, even though they outnumbered the British and the Commonwealth forces and the expatriate Europeans flying with them, the Poles, Czechs, people like that, was because the Rolls-Merlin engine had a design flaw. It was carbureted. So when they went into a dive, it would stall out. And when it stalled out at a 45 to 60 degree or better dive, the pilot had no control over the aircraft, which meant that it was just falling in the air without power, so the Germans could get an easy kill. Whereas the 109 had an inverted BMW DB601 fuel-injected engine, which didn't matter the angle of attack or angle of dive or ascent. It never starved of fuel because it was a fuel-injected model, and that gave them the advantage.
And there's the 109.
Yeah, that's a 109. That's a 109 G6 or G10. That's a 109 G10. That aircraft came out about 2.5 years after the Battle of Britain.
And this is before the 190.
Oh yeah, the 190 came out. Was debuted in August of 41.
Yeah. Thank God. And let's talk a little bit about the bombing force that the Luftwaffe had. Of course, it had the famous Stuka dive bomber. But I guess as the Battle of Britain progressed, these became pretty easy targets for the RAF.
Yeah, the Stuka was the worst aircraft on planet Earth to send against Britain for 3 reasons. One, it didn't carry enough of a bomb load to really make a difference. Second of all, it had no defensive capability other than a tail gunner and no maneuverability. 3, it was so slow, its cruising speed was almost just above the landing speed of a 109. And the German fighter pilots hated flying with the Stukas because they had to lower their flaps, weave, slow down to almost stall speed to keep up with them, to protect them. And the Stukas were just destroyed. I mean, that was probably the largest concentration of Luftwaffe aircraft lost during the Battle of Britain were Stukas until Goering finally pulled them out of action. And I've interviewed a few Stuka pilots who flew during the Battle of Britain, Kurt Kuhlmeier being one of them, and Gerhard Studemann. And they said every time they got in the cockpit to fly to Britain, they all began looking in their English-German dictionaries so they could speak better to their captors.
If they lived. And then here's the famous Henkel. Do I have that pronunciation anywhere near correct?
Henkel.
Bomber. 2-engine bomber, is obviously, as you can see. It was, do I have that right? It was the primary German bomber for the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, it was a primary fighter. They had the Ju-88 medium bomber as well, but the Heinkel HU-111 was the primary bomber. That was what actually, the picture I threw up for you, Hayo Hermann, that's what he was flying that night that he was flying to East India Docks, and he was to drop his bombs and accidentally bombed a tenement area of apartments in London, which really just enraged Churchill. So that's when he got on the horn to Arthur Harris and said, I want a retaliatory strike on Berlin. And that's how that all started.
Yeah. Now, Greg, was this a point you wanted to talk about? Was the German Air Force's lack of a strategic bombing capability? Do I recall that right?
Very much. With all of your programs all year long on the air war, if you consider that the B-17 and the Heinkel were both roughly started out in the mid-30s, started to be produced in the late 30s, look at just what you have on this slide right here. The B-17 has a much larger bomb load. It has a longer range. In our heads, we can see the B-17 there, and it has the 4 engines as opposed to only the 2, and sort of quite a few machine gun nests in the back and on the sides and on the top and everything. Basically, it certainly, Glenn and maybe Colin certainly could really chime in. The Germans, for all practical purposes, did not have a strategic bomber or even a strategic bombing concept that I think greatly hindered them throughout the war, and certainly the Battle of Britain. That was the point I wanted to make here, and I think it's a segue into where you guys were going, but I'll let you chime in on that. So.
Yeah. And any other comments at this point from my guests, from my experts? So I'm going to jump back now to what's going on in the U.S. and the Democratic convention comes around, and Roosevelt does get his 3rd term, which was unprecedented. And this in itself is another program. I've lectured on the 1940 election several times, and it fascinating developments, as to how this came about for the 3rd term. But it's not where we're going tonight. But I just want to keep balancing out and make people understand that all this is going on in Europe, and there's all this happening in the United States that has a huge impact on the results of the election, and I think the results of the war. And then, Colin, here's Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, who played such an important role in the Battle of Britain, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Hugh Dowding was a true visionary in defensive fighter tactics, and he really bumped heads with Lee Mallory and some of the others who thought throwing a lot of aircraft up would solve the problem. And he was trying to say, no, you don't want to do that. You want to use precision deployments of aircraft in specific areas of contention without wasting fuel, time, and everything else. And he was getting hammered. And finally, the Air Ministry finally wrote him out of the history books, and they just got rid of him.
And he was the one that in May 1940 convinced Churchill and the other higher-ups not to send more RAF fighters to France.
That's correct, because he knew that they would need them to defend Britain.
Yeah. And they lost a fairly large percentage of their fighter force in France, 25, 30%, before the Battle of Britain even started.
Yeah, the Battle of France, the Germans harvested a lot of aircraft in combat.
Yeah. And it's always been surprising to me how this man, who really should be considered the hero of the Battle of Britain, is shunted aside afterwards due to the military politics of it all, and you hear virtually nothing about him for the rest of the war.
Or even after the war.
Yeah. Okay, and now we're into some of the key dates in the Battle of Britain. September 15th is, remind me, my friends, Eagle Day. Is that what the Germans called it?
Yeah, Adlertag, Eagle Day.
Yeah. And it's one of the 3 or 4 days that they put together sort of a maximum effort to try to take out the Luftwaffe. They had been doing that for several weeks before. As you said, take out the RAF. As you said, Colin, they began by attacking the radar sites and the air bases, the RAF air bases. And you can see them all sort of listed here as to where these air bases were, and then where the German bases were just across the channel in France and Belgium. And they were pretty close to knocking out the air bases in early September of 1940. Is that correct?
They were close, but what saved the RAF more than anything was Hitler's ego and anger. That's when he wanted retaliatory strikes on London, Coventry, major cities, to retaliate against the bombing of Berlin, Dusseldorf, and places like that. And when Goering gave the order to stop bombing the RAF bases, to have the bombers hit the cities, well, that gave Fighter Command time to rebuild and catch their breath, because they weren't worried about losing aircraft being bombed on the ground. The factories could then get aircraft to the airfields. They could still continue training the pilots. So it was a self-inflicted wound, really.
Yeah. Always fascinated me as you read some of the original history, the memoirs and so forth. They always referred to the what we now think of fighter planes, airplanes, as machines. especially Churchill. He always talked about how many machines were in the air. And of course, August 1920, another famous speech, or August 20th, 1940, famous speech by Churchill, perhaps maybe his most famous speech, the few. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And that was after he had been at one of those fighter control locations, perhaps Oxford, and spent a good part of the day underground watching how close it came to the British depleting all their reserves. And just at the last minute, the Germans retreat for the day, and the British are able to, at least continue on for the day. So it's one of, I think, the greatest speeches in English history.
Well, one of the things most people don't realize was, although Hitler wanted retaliatory bombing against English cities, he gave a direct order to Goering. He said, "You are not to bomb St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster, or any historic area that could be treasured in the future."
And it's on August 24th that accidental Luftwaffe bomber bombs the east end of London.
Yeah, I sent you the photograph of Hayo. His interview with me was pretty comical about that. And when he got back, he had no idea what he had hit because it was dark and searchlights and flak and everything else. And he lands, and there's a phone call within 3 or 4 hours of landing back at his base. And it was Goering on the phone saying, "I need you in Berlin by tomorrow morning, and wear your best uniform. The Fuhrer would like to have a word."
That's got to be a little scary.
Well, he knew he wasn't getting decorated.
And Churchill retaliates, and he sends British bombers, such as they were, which were not, very dangerous bombers, if you will, but sends, I think, a relative handful, a couple dozen planes to bomb Berlin.
Yeah, Bristol Blenheim bombers and a few early Manchester bombers, which were not, not the Lancasters of legend.
Yeah. And that's then what turns Hitler to retaliating against the British and ordering the bombing of London and other British cities.
Right.
And that then is what takes the focus of the Luftwaffe away from the airfields. And
the bomber force was hitting the cities instead of the airfields, and that was tactically a great error.
Right. And the London Blitz begins. RAF is surprised at this, actually relieved at it, I suppose, is the way to say it. Eagle Day was one of the key days where, as I mentioned before, the Luftwaffe now thinks that they're very close to knocking the Luftwaffe or the RAF out of the air. They make a huge attack with large numbers all over Britain, not just London. And the RAF surprises them with how strong they still are, and I guess shoots down more Luftwaffe planes than the Luftwaffe shot down British planes.
Well, that was a Dowding tactic. Dowding didn't want all of his aircraft to be exposed. He only had specific units like 11th Squadron and people like that in certain tactical locations engage the bombers here and there. So without having the after-action reports from the German fighter pilots coming back and saying, "Oh, we only engaged 20, 30 fighters," another unit would say we had 12 or 16 fighters. There were another 50, 60 fighters on the ground that never got into the air because they weren't needed. So Goering was under the false impression that they had done their job. They had pretty much wiped out fighter command, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah. And clearly the Germans were overestimating or underestimating the RAF capabilities, overestimating just how many planes they had shot down.
And not just the planes. I mean, planes can be replaced, but replacing a pilot was a lot more difficult. And they thought that after all the planes they had shot down, they didn't take into account. And Gallen told me, he said, "Well, we seem to forget that when we got shot down over Britain, we became a prisoner. When they got shot down, they had tea and came back at us."
Yeah. About 40,000 people are killed in the Blitz, and not just in London. There are many other English cities significantly bombed, Liverpool, Coventry, Birmingham among them. And maybe I should stop here and invite Greg. Greg, you wanted to draw sort of a inference about what happened to the Brits versus when later in the war the Brits turned around with the Americans and bombed Germany.
Right, definitely. I just wanted to ask, and Colin might really be the expert here. Did this have an impact on the British and to a lesser extent American popular opinion as to whether or not it was legitimate to bomb German cities at night when you clearly don't really have any good idea what you're hitting? I wondered if that had if that had an impact, or maybe even conversely, whether or not sort of ordinary average Brits later in the war felt a certain amount of sympathy for the the Fritzes and Helgas in Hamburg and Munich and Cologne who were getting clobbered in the same way they had been several years earlier. I don't know the answer to that. I sort of was curious as to how this affected things as the war progressed.
Well, the British citizens who were civilians or military during the war that I interviewed had no compunction whatsoever about bombing German cities because their cities had been bombed as well. So they had no moral issue with it. Our country, on the other hand, and I interviewed several air officers, Jimmy Doolittle, Curtis LeMay, those guys, and they did have a moral problem with bombing strictly civilian targets. That not even Curtis LeMay, who would bomb anybody on a good day, wanted to bomb strictly civilian targets. He wanted to have a military component to it, whereas Arthur Harris of Bomber Command, and I interviewed some of his pilots, Bill Reed, the Victoria Cross recipient Lancaster pilot who flew a lot of missions bombing Hamburg, Cologne, and places like that. He told me that a lot of the men in the bomber units knew they were going to be killing a lot of women and children, and it really haunted them. And of a lot of the guys who had what we call PTSD today, they had a moral and ethical problem with knowing they were killing civilians. They didn't mind killing factory workers or killing soldiers or whatever. But they did have some of the guys, like Guy Gibson's crew, the famous Dam Busters. Those guys were very relieved to get a legitimate military or economic target as opposed to bombing a city because they weren't happy with what was going on.
Yeah.
And I think it says a lot about their moral character to feel that way anyway.
Yeah. This next shot is the famous shot of St. Paul's Cathedral. This is actually, I'm pretty sure, taken in December of 1940, after the Luftwaffe had turned to night bombing because they were getting murdered during the day, of course. And we're going to be visiting St. Paul's Cathedral, which has, of course, a long, long history, well before World War II. But the World War II story is fascinating in that every night they would station these, I think they called them fire watchers, on that roof. And as the incendiaries came down, they would literally pick them up and throw them onto the street below. And the belief is that they saved St. Paul's several times during the day. So we'll hear a lot more about that. Now, back to the U.S. So this is now, I believe, how the Battle of Britain, which resulted in the Republicans nominating Wendell Willkie as an interventionist, begins to have this huge impact. It's in the middle of the election campaign, and Roosevelt is able to pull off the basis for a destroyers deal, which at the time was a huge deal. I think in retrospect, most historians are like, really didn't have maybe that big of an impact on the deal because the British got a bunch of really broken down destroyers that I guess helped them some. But the idea that you could pull this off in the middle of a presidential election, and Wendell Willkie actually supported this. As he supported, I'm sorry, this is the America First, which I'm going to skip over because we already covered that, but it gets started in September of 1940, Yale University. Interesting enough, Gerald Ford is among one of the first students to sign up for America First at that time at Yale. But the other part that occurs is that the first peacetime draft in the history of America takes place right in the middle of the presidential election, passed by Congress on September 16th. The actual first drawing of the draft numbers occurred just a couple of weeks before the election. And this results in 1 million men being drafted in the next few months into the U.S. Army. And I guess my argument is this would never have happened had, say, Bob Taft been nominated by the Republicans. Because again, Wendell Willkie went along with this. Wendell Willkie believed that this was the right thing to do to prepare for war. Right. Operation Sea Lion, the British or the German invasion of England, is called off by Hitler sometime in mid to late September because it became clear that the Luftwaffe could not get command of the air from the RAF. And although I don't know that the British knew that it had been called off and knew that the threat had passed, but at this point, I guess you could argue that the British have won the Battle of Britain.
The British knew.
British knew?
Yeah, because Wilhelm Canaris told them.
Helps to have a friend at the high levels of the German government.
Yeah.
I don't know, any other comments on this? It's always been fascinating to me to think about what would have happened had the Germans attempted it, even with not having command of the air. Would there have been a significant battle? Could the Germans have clawed their way ashore and made a difference?
Can I answer that one?
Anybody else can?
I don't think the Germans would have had a hillbilly's chance in hell of taking all of Britain if they invaded, for three reasons. One, because they still had a lot of soldiers in Great Britain and a reserve auxiliary force numbering about 3 million men. And then you also had the tenacity of the average Briton who, since William the Conqueror, learned a valuable lesson: never surrender your soil. And then they had the other problem of the fact that if they had invaded Britain, Roosevelt already had a secret agreement that if Britain were invaded by Germany, he was going to declare war on Germany. Most people don't know that.
No, no.
Wow.
But if Britain were invaded by Germany, that was like the straw that would break the camel's back. And that would force him into a situation where he had no choice. Because just like with Woodrow Wilson in World War I, all of these big industrialists and bankers in America had invested billions of dollars in that day's money, trillions in today's money, in British banks and in British Commonwealth banks around the world. Even France had a sizable amount of American investment money, Switzerland as well. They would have lost their fortunes if Britain had fallen. And Roosevelt was not going to let these bankers and people who got him into office and kept him in office losing their fortunes if that happened.
Glenn, I have two questions.
Yeah.
Who was the gentleman that you mentioned? I guess he was German. He told the British that there wasn't going to be an invasion.
Canaris, that's what Colin mentioned.
Yeah, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. He was head of the Abwehr, and he was very anti-Hitler. He was involved in 3 plots to kill Hitler. Including the Stauffenberg plot, which is where he got discovered, and later he was arrested, put in Flossenburg, and executed.
And my other question is, during, even before the Battle of Britain or during it, how many Canadian or U.S. pilots were involved, were flying for the British?
Those were the Eagle squadrons. There were a couple of them. Don Blakesley I knew, Frank Gabreski, Gabby Gabreski, and those guys I knew. But he got there right after this. But there were probably around, I think there were maybe 122 pilots who were American, dozens of Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders. They were just littered. And then you had like 100 Czechs. You had about 80 Poles, with more filtering in as they escaped Europe. You had about 9 nations representing the RAF during the Battle of Britain. The Dutch as well, Norwegians. I mean, all these expatriates who fled to Britain who were pilots or trained as pilots began flying for the RAF.
Beautiful.
There's an excellent book, Ken, by Alex Kershaw, who we've interviewed a couple of times on our program, written 4 or 5 years ago at least, called The Few. And when I first picked it up, I thought it was going to be about the few as in the RAF, the few, but it's about the few Americans, in the dozens actually, who flew for the British in during the Battle of Britain. And it's just really well done. There's some names there I had never heard of. A couple of sort of very high level, I don't know how you describe them, New York aristocrats, if you will, who only went for the adventure and the fame and ended up dead. But it's like all of Alex's books. It's an easy, very good read.
Glenn, I'm a huge fan of Alex's book, The Longest Winter.
Yeah, another good one.
A phenomenal book. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question here that none of us should ever ask, and because none of us can ever answer, but it's that type of historical what if question, right? Leaving this map up right here, would this invasion have succeeded had the helicopter been in its prime? Could this invasion have been pulled off with helicopters?
Certainly would have been a whole different set of factors, would it not? Right? This was whatever, 10 or 15 years later.
I think they'd have just been targets.
Fair enough. You would still need air supremacy, but of course they'd be way down on the deck there. It'd be hard to see them on radar, and who knows, whatever. Probably not, but whatever. So.
Well, being somebody who's a veteran and flown on helicopters over some bad terrain with bad people down below, you don't want to be real low to people with small arms.
There's another element of this which doesn't get a lot of historical attention, but here and there's a couple of Churchill biographers who've gotten into this. Let's say the Luftwaffe had at least been able to neutralize the RAF. At least it made it, sort of an even fight, right? Reduce the RAF to a lower level than it actually was, and they had attempted the invasion. It's not as if the British fleet was just going to sit up in its port in the Orkneys and in the Firth of Forth and not come out.
That's
right?
correct.
I mean, they were going to come out with everything they had. Now, many of them would have gotten sunk because of the German Air Force. But, the German Air Force was not exactly accomplished at sinking ships, especially, battleships and cruisers and so forth. I mean, I think it would have been one hell of a fight right in that body of water there with the Royal Navy really kicking the behind out of the German. And the other thing is the German Navy didn't have the logistics or the means to get across the channel. They were almost going to paddle across like William the Conqueror did 1,000 years earlier.
Well, don't forget also, in part of the planning for Sea Lion, one of the great delays in Hitler's plan was they had to build the landing craft.
Yes.
They didn't have any. I mean, German military capability did not include amphibious operations. It wasn't one of their strong suits. And you're right. I mean, if the HMS King George V and its battle group had fled Scapa Flow and headed towards the Channel, it still wouldn't have worked because the Germans didn't have the sea power to combat the Royal Navy.
Now, a counter argument to that I heard one time is that the German U-boats would have been, laying in wait for them to come. And that's a strong argument too. And I'm sure that the British Navy would have lost a lot of ships in that respect. But again, it would have been a fascinating battle.
Well, but you're negating the one factor I mentioned before, that although we didn't get actively really involved until late 40, early 41, with Roosevelt unleashing the U.S. Navy to escort British convoys in violation of neutrality, that Roosevelt wasn't going to let that happen.
Yeah. And in fact, let's bring this to a close as we come along here. Then let me make my last couple of points. So Roosevelt wins the election by a landslide, sort of 55-45. And I really believe that the war in Europe resulted in Wilkie being the Republican candidate and gave FDR a third term. That perhaps he would not have won had it not been just for the timing. Had the war in Europe been delayed until the fall for whatever set of reasons, right? Or had it happened as Hitler wanted it to in 1939. He delayed the invasion of France like 7 times, as I recall. And that then leads to the last and perhaps the most important result, and that's Churchill coming up with the Lend-Lease program, right? That he announces by one of his fireside chats in January. Lindbergh still, being Lindbergh, being the isolationist, and still a very strong isolationist movement in the United States, testifies against it in Congress. I had a picture in here. I don't have it now. Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee, testifies in front of Congress in favor of Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease, in fact, is passed in March of 1941. And again, one of those things that perhaps from a timing standpoint may not have happened had the election turned out different. And the election was certainly impacted by the events in Europe.
Well, Lend-Lease was good for the American industrial complex. It also created more jobs to help alleviate the pressure of the Great Depression.
Right, right, right. Because really, the second round of the Great Depression, which started in 38 and 39, really didn't get over that until we began the arsenal of democracy, if you will. We began building the armaments for the European war, and that's what finally brought us out of the economic issues of the day.
Yep.
So that's all I wanted to get to, and this has been very, very good. Would any of you, Ken, Greg, Colin, like to make any final points about the Battle of Britain?
Well, Glenn, may I make my one contribution here?
Sure.
Huge fan of the movie Battle of Britain. I'm sure I saw it many, many years ago when I really didn't understand the dynamics. I watched it when I had COVID pneumonia and was knocking on heaven's door, and then I watched it again. And I have a slight connection here to Goring. I'm a fan of the Dutch master painter Johannes Vermeer, and Hermann Goring once traded 137 stolen paintings for a fake Vermeer painting. And the story was after he was captured, an American officer came to his jail cell and told him that the Vermeer that he loved so much was a fake. And reportedly, Goring couldn't believe somebody would rip him off like that. So,
Colin or Greg, any last thought or comment?
Well, I'd like to say that historically, the Battle of Britain was really the first time that the Germans got a real big slap in the face. And if the Battle of Britain had not occurred and put so much German resources at the bottom of the channel or scattering the English countryside, there's a good possibility that the Battle of Britain was responsible for the additional delays of Operation Barbarossa the following year.
Yeah. So many great what if discussions we can have. So many.
Glenn, I know you started with this gentleman and we sort of segued into FDR there, and I think rightly so. But throughout this whole thing, don't forget to go back to that gentleman you started out with, Winston Churchill. I think without him there, I think this thing turns out differently. Like you say, I think there was a peace faction there, and there might have been enough political pressure. So let's not forget about him when we get into all the tactics and all the what ifs. So.
Yeah. The movie made, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago, just before the pandemic. I think it was called Darkest Hour with Gary Olds playing Churchill.
Yeah, Gary Oldman.
Oldman. Yeah, he plays maybe the best Churchill I've ever seen by an actor. And the movie is I think very good. It gets a little historically inaccurate at times. Yeah, let's say.
Yeah.
But it portrays, that peace movement led by Lord Halifax, who could have been the prime minister instead of Churchill, right? And Halifax attempting to lead peace discussions with the Germans through the Italians, and Churchill's able to push that away.
And also Prince Edward, who was King Edward, who abdicated. He was a good friend of Hitler's too, and he was also on the bench trying to negotiate a peace.
Yeah, and I really believe that if you read the books on it, there's one called, I think is it 7 Days in May. There's some just excellent books on it, and just a twist or a turn here and there. Had they not gotten as many troops out of Dunkirk as they had Dunkirk been a disaster, that peace movement could have won the day. Because at that time, remember, Churchill was not the Churchill we think of now. He was thought of as, that guy who, caused Gallipoli back in World War I, and that guy who kept jumping from party to party. He had not proven himself yet as the legendary Churchill that he becomes. Okay, thank you guys. We'll say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
And you all can stay with us as Glenn just joined us. I also gave you all the ability to turn back on your videos if you would like. I'll ask Glenn here to unmute. And before Glenn, I hope the board meeting was going well, and sorry to tear you away from that. But before we jump to you with questions, we had a couple things written down here in the chat. All I'm going to do real quick is take our station break, give everybody a chance to breathe. Lots of great information from that video. How'd you like watching yourself?
Talking to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just came on 1 minute ago, so I only caught my ugly puss for 30 seconds. So
sometimes that's enough.
Yeah, that was more than enough. It's like more than I look in the mirror every day.
Well, we want to quickly go ahead and thank our sponsors. I believe I'm sharing my screen here, or I'm sharing everything. Am I sharing this?
The recording is coming up.
Oh, well, let's make sure we share the correct window here. There we go. Okay, that's our restream that was going. All right, here it is. We want to thank Tobacco Free Adagio Health for sponsoring our program tonight. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out all there is to know about tobacco free at their website, tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. We'd also like to thank UPMC for Life. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans, by veterans, that can save you money and get you more benefits. And you can view all their plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. Our new magazine just went to the printer. So we've been talking about it for a couple weeks. This is going to be hitting your mailboxes, hopefully within the next couple of weeks once they get done printing it. It is free. If you're just joining us for the first time and you don't receive this, it's because we don't have your address. Please send us that address at Sean. You can see it in my window, SHAUN at veteransbreakfastclub.org, and I'll be happy to send you a free copy and get you signed up for future copies. And if you're just like, hey, I'd like to hand out 25 of these because I love VBC, we'd love to have you do that. Let me know, and we could send you a box. It would be great to get the word out about VBC. And as you can see, it's going to be a compilation of a lot of the conversations we've had here on Thursday nights throughout this year. And we will also put a survey into the chat, as today was a bit of an outlier, but we will, over the course of the next 5 months until the end of the year, have a couple more of these recorded conversations as Glenn will be leaving to go to the UK on the UK trip in September. So there'll be a couple times where we'll record something and we'll play it just like that, just like we did tonight. And we hope that you all enjoyed it. We do have a couple other conversations and programs coming up. July 15th, mark your calendar. This is Military Spouses with Simone Garindo. She is the author of The Wives. This is a New York Times bestseller, and Daria Summers will be rejoining us to host that program on Monday night. Next Wednesday, how the Allies almost lost the air war in Europe, or not Wednesday, sorry, next Thursday, July 18th. Glenn will be here to host that program next Thursday, which is a continuation, kind of a part 2 of the Battle of Britain, and then moving into next Thursday. And then the following week, very excited by this program, War and Transgenerational Trauma. I recently finished, and you could see Carl Shakatano. And the only reason I know that is because it's in the book, and he actually sounds it out in the book. But it's an incredible book. It's a graphic memoir. So he's an artist, a comic book artist, and he drew and wrote a book about his dad's service in Vietnam and his relationship with his dad. Recently finished it. Incredible book. It's called The Heart That Fed. Look it up, Carl Shakatano, or just look up The Heart That Fed. I loved it because I'm a big geek and I've always loved comic books. So it was a really interesting read for me, and it's really well drawn. It's almost like reading a movie, but excited to have him join us and talk about that coming up in a couple Mondays. But we have Glenn joining us now. So if you were with us during, excuse me, the Battle of Britain over the last hour, feel free to have the questions out. Greg Yost, you are with us as well. Feel free to chime in, Greg, whenever you would like. Barbara Smith started us off in the chat. Walk down the 76 steps of the Battle of Britain bunker. Listen to the presentation of the chart room, as well as toured throughout the museum upstairs as well. Hope you'll get to see it whenever you go on the tour. And also Scott Masters, following the end of the video, I recently interviewed a vet who golfed with Prince Edward when doing RAF training in Bermuda. So a couple chats, but Glenn.
Well, in fact, the Oxford bunker is day 1 on our tour. So we'll be walking down those 76 steps after most of you have flown from Pittsburgh to London and taken a bus to Oxford. So some of you may be falling down the steps, but you can actually go online, and one of these days here soon, I'm going to be emailing this to all of our travelers. You can go on YouTube and search for Oxford bunker. And you can go on the tour, online. And it's really fascinating because, it gives you a preview of what you're going to be seeing.
And you can't fall down the stairs.
And yeah, that's right. You don't fall down the stairs. Listen, I hope this was okay for everybody in terms of us recording this first. We had a conflict with the board meeting tonight that I'm a member of the board for. So, and we wanted to give this a little experiment as well, because as Sean said, we're going to try this for a couple of times while I'm in England in September and record a couple of other programs. So someone held their thumb up. Who was that? Identify yourself, sir. Who was that?
Steve Corbett.
Steve? What did you think?
It was very good. I enjoyed every bit of it. A fine job.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Greg Yost, who's on tonight, I don't know if Colin and Ken Kasich are on. I don't see here. I see Greg. You know, they're just great helpers to us, great supporters of the VBC. They're on regularly, and their knowledge of World War II is extensive. So was really pleased to have that, and not what I wanted to avoid was just me lecturing for an hour as if you were in some classroom. So hopefully this came off okay that way.
I thought it was great personally. I mean, not just patting ourselves on the back, but it felt like a regular program because it's kind of, you know, a round robin and great experts and great opinions and historical knowledge and facts in the room. I did unmute Greg, but Carol has her hand up.
Yeah, I was really listening with great care to the stories about the bombs falling in England, because I actually had an aunt by marriage who lived through the Battle of Britain. She lived in London. She was the older of two children. She was at the ripe old age of 7 years old, going on 8 when this was all happening. And she had a brother who was about 2 years younger than she. And I will never forget the stories she told me about the decisions you had to make as children. The parents, like many parents in Britain, packed their kids up and sent them out to the country to be safe. For a variety of reasons, it just wasn't working. And so they brought the kids home. So now they had to live with, are we going to survive all these bombs? And Sylvia told me that in the morning, you know, the mother would pack up their lunches, send them off to school with their gas masks. And the kids were instructed at school and at home, if air raid sirens go off while you're in transit, you have to make the decision whether to go home or to go to school. So as a 7-year-old, she described incidents where this would happen, and she would have to make life and death decisions for her and her 5-year-old brother in transit to school. I cannot imagine that. I just can't imagine it. And I tip my hat many times to the spunk and the resilience of the British people. I'm very grateful that Aunt Sylvia survived it all to the ripe old age of 90. We just buried her about a year ago. Just loved her stories about World War II, but that one has always stuck with me. Children having to make life and death decisions for themselves on the way to school.
Thank you, Carol. That's, yeah. You know, the other story I've read in various books about the Battle of Britain are children who collected shrapnel as toys. And there was one young man who, you know, was 7 or 8 years old during the Battle of Britain, collected shrapnel and kept it all his life and passed it on through his family. So,
just one other comment. I don't know if Colin's on tonight or if he was just recorded tonight, but I did get to see the Derbyshire dams where the Lancasters practiced their dam busting before they went and hit their German targets. Fascinating place. Fascinating place.
Yeah. Any comments? You know, I've given this lecture on the Battle of Britain in different ways at different times over the years to different groups. And what I always found fascinating for me, not only the Battle of Britain is fascinating in itself, but the impact it had on the US 1940 presidential elections. That, at least the way I look at it, that had it not been for the impact of the war in Europe, it could have changed the outcome of that 1940 election. had a different Republican candidate been chosen, an isolationist, that Roosevelt would not have been able to do some of the things he did during the election of 1940. The Selective Service Act, the first peacetime draft ever, occurred during the election. The Destroyer for Bases deal during the election, and then post-election Lend-Lease. Did anybody have any comments on that or thoughts on that?
I don't believe so. No, I don't see anything in the chat, but
I certainly have quite a few thoughts on that, as I have on most things. One of the things you might want to mention, Glenn, if you're an expert, I'm not a super expert on Edward R. Murrow, the radio reporter who used to report from London, and the impact that he had on the American popular opinion, because they would do live, newscasts from London, being back to the United States, and this was mostly during the Blitz. And when the Germans switched to nighttime bombing in the fall and through the winter, people would go to bed at night and not know if they were waking up, or not know if their city was going to be there. And he would report about this every night. And I think, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on Edward R. Murrow's reporting from London during that time. So.
Well, if no one else will, I will. And that's that it made a significant difference in American public opinion. Lots of people tuned into him, that great voice that he had, the introduction he had, I can't remember it for sure, but something like, this is Edward R. Murrow from the rooftop of so-and-so building watching the German bombers come in tonight, and it did have a significant impact. I mean, what I didn't get into too much of, mentioned a little bit about Charles Lindbergh and the creation of the American First Committee, is there's something that's referred to as the Great Debate that occurred in 39, 40, and into 41. And the Great Debate was the isolationist versus the interventionist debate. And we forget back then just how dramatically isolationist the United States was in the late 30s and early 40s. And it's one reason it took so long for FDR to declare war. It's one reason he waited until we were attacked in order to overcome that isolationist feeling. Not just from the Republican Party, from his own party as well. There were lots of isolationists. So it was a huge debate at that time, and it was never clear how it was going to turn out until late 1940 and 1941. Probably not clear until war was declared.
Was that just a knee-jerk reaction to World War I, and that we did not want to be involved? If I remember from my history class, we did not want to be involved in Europe's wars.
Right. The popular understanding, the popular feeling became, and frankly, I think there's some truth in it, that we should never have been in World War I, that the Europeans took advantage of us, that it was wrong for us to be in it, et cetera, et cetera. That, we had the two oceans, we didn't need, and let's not forget that we were a nation of immigrants, something like a third, 30% of all the citizens of the United States were of German ancestry, right? And most of those people left Europe in the 1800s and early part of the 20th century because they wanted to get away from all the wars. So, that was part of the reason. I mean, you can go back to George Washington and, the early part of our country. And the sentiment was, do not get involved in foreign wars. George Washington had many statements along those lines. All right. So, the United States, there's another great story, and I've lectured on this. If you go back to Theodore Roosevelt, read the three-part biography of Theodore Roosevelt by, I'm going to forget his name right now, it will come to me, and how it was Roosevelt and other internationalists at that time that created the Spanish-American War and took the United States from being a isolationist country into an international setting. And that really set the stage for our intervention in World War I. Before that, we had no interest in foreign wars, as you would say back then. So,
If
thoughts?
you're
said
inter-
you
Go ahead.
go ahead, Greg.
If you're interested in sort of a pop culture angle on this, the movie Sergeant York was made in 39 or 40 or 41. And of course, it was about Alvin York, the World War I hero, Medal of Honor winner, who at the beginning of World War I was a pacifist. Now, he grew up in rural Tennessee and he was an excellent shot, to hunt and everything like that. But then he gets drafted and then he becomes a war hero. And to a certain extent, that Gary Cooper movie Sergeant York was sort of, to a certain extent, let's be honest, a propaganda effort to try to dissuade the pacifists and isolationists, that even people who sort of don't like killing everything have to rise to the occasion when danger arises. So interesting angle there if anyone ever wants to research that.
Yeah. Great movie. Yeah.
Excellent movie.
It has all those anchors in the arguments, the great debate of the day. It's really well done movie, and I agree 100%, Greg. That's kind of what the message was behind it.
Glenn, you've mentioned that multiple times you've given this lecture. In your Q&As during this, has anything sort of, they may have thrown you a curveball based on this, or maybe one of the best questions you've received from one of your lectures?
I can't think of one right off the top of my head. I think the approach I came up with of discussing the start of the war in Europe, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, and relating it to the presidential elections of 1940 surprised a lot of people. They didn't know that there was that connection, and that it had such a significant impact on the outcome of the 1940 election, but I think on the outcome of the war. I mean, that's passing the Selective Service Act, which resulted in 1 million men being drafted into the U.S. Army in late 40 and early 41, was a huge event in preparing the U.S. for war. One of the other interesting aspects of that, so I'm not trying to promote FDR, although I'm fascinated by the man and his presidency. So FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, okay, just like his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, all right, 20 odd years earlier. FDR watched Woodrow Wilson very closely doing all this. FDR was an interventionist in run up to World War I. And he learned a lot of lessons about the issues that Wilson faced, and how he felt that Wilson failed the United States in not being prepared for World War I. His stance in pre-World War I was much more close to the general Republican stance pre-World War I, led by Theodore Roosevelt, which was be prepared, raise the army, improve the Navy, train, be prepared to go to war. Had Theodore Roosevelt had his way, we'd been involved in World War I right after the sinking of the Lusitania. He thought Wilson was a coward for not taking advantage of that and bringing us into World War I. Right or wrong, I'm not trying to comment on it all right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the history of it. That's the actual impact that it had on FDR, and why FDR was so adamant about being prepared for World War II, more so. I mean, we were still ill prepared, but we were a lot better prepared for World War II than we were for World War I.
And as for give us a preview for what we're looking forward to next week, because that'll be back to our regular live programming.
Yeah, regular live program. So next week is really the kind of the culmination of all these programs we've done on the air war over Europe. And it's my effort to try to bring it to one, sort of 1 hour and 10-minute program that reviews a bit of that and draws some conclusions. And how close, I think, if you'd have asked me a year ago how much I knew about the air war over Europe, I said, oh yeah, I know a lot. That's one of my favorite topics. I've always read a lot. Well, the last 9-10 months of having all these experts on the programs and reading all these books of theirs and interviewing these veterans has taught me that I didn't know anything compared to, some of these people are just incredibly deep in their knowledge, just incredible. Marilyn Walton with her POW experience, Colin Heaton with his knowledge of the Luftwaffe, all these veterans' experiences. So I learned a lot. So this is going to be my effort to try to draw some conclusions out of all that and realization of how much I didn't know and probably still don't know.
Well, definitely, I think we're all going to look forward to that. So you can't miss it. And then as we go into the later part of this year, we've sort of shifted this back to a Greatest Generation Live program. We'll sort of wrap our thoughts. We'll still probably cover air war periodically, but will we be focusing more on just the World War II in general?
Yeah, I'd say the rest of the year, August is going to be very light because everybody's busy in August. We have a couple of programs scheduled. August 1st, we're going to do one on Brad, I see you on. We're going to do one on the Battle of Guadalcanal. The actual anniversary would be August 7th or 8th, but the guests that I'd like to have on weren't available. So they're available August 1. And we're actually going to focus on the Army at Guadalcanal. The Marines are always the focus of attention, Brad. I don't know why that is, but they're always the focus of attention. And the Navy, all the naval battles we covered many times. But the Army also played a key role in the battle. And so we're going to focus on that in August, the August 1st program. I think we have a general open conversation scheduled in August on World War II. And we have a Jeopardy program on World War II in August. But into the fall, it will return to Greatest Generation Live. It's the 80th anniversary of a lot of battles. So the first one I think we're going to do is the 80th anniversary of Market Garden in September, and then fall through for there. And I think I'm going to make December the Battle of the Bulge month. So I think that ought to be pretty fun.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us for tonight's lecture and for the discussion afterwards. We look forward to seeing you on Monday night for more stories through VBC. Hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.